Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel for all you guys returning, and welcome to the channel for all you new guys. I am Shooter. In today's video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Usually I do power scaling videos, and this, yes, it will involve quite a bit of fighting. It will not actually be a power scaling video, because if I actually power scaled both of the verses, then this video would be like extremely boring and there wouldn't be any point in it. In this video, I will be putting a total of 5 different creatures from the Roblox game Creatures of Sonaria into Monster Hunter World and going over whether or not they could survive in Monster Hunter World. Now, couple things that I need to say. For starters, I will not be doing power scaling for this video. If I were to be doing power scaling, then this would be extremely one-sided. Creatures of Sonaria creatures, scaling-wise, range from as low as 7-dimensional to as high as, like, infinite layers into, like, 20-dimensional. And there's a lot of really ridiculous bullcrap scaling for Creatures of Sonaria that can get really, really crazy, and obviously, if I were to properly scale the verse, obviously anything in the verse would survive in Monster Hunter. And so for this video, I will be using verse equalization. Additionally, I will be ignoring a lot of game mechanics like traits or plushie boosts that you can, or like the aggro or cower buffs you can get in the actual game. Those I will not be using for this video, so yeah. Additionally, in the game and also in lore, creatures can survive in pretty much any environment, regardless of like food or water issues or just the temperature of the environment, no matter how weak or good they are against a specific temperature. Like if a creature seems to be well suited to be somewhere cold, it can still survive somewhere hot in Creatures of Sonaria. This will be something that obviously stays the same, as it's something that applies to the creatures both in the games and in lore. However, I will be mostly restricting the creatures that I go over in this video to one specific area or locale in the Monster Hunter World. So, for example, if I have a creature in the Ancient Forest, I won't be allowing it to also go to the Everstream, Elder's Recess, and Wildspire Waste at the same time, just because it should be capable of doing so. I will be restricting each creature to 1 or 2 areas for the most part. One last thing I want to go over before we get into the video itself is that if you enjoy this one, if y'all enjoy this video, let me know in the comments, because I like both Monster Hunter and Creatures of Sonaria, and if y'all enjoy this type of video, I would be more than happy to put more creatures from Creatures of Sonaria into Monster Hunter, or maybe some other creatures from some other verses into Monster Hunter. Additionally, I do plan on doing some more Monster Hunter related matchups and videos in the future, so if you like Monster Hunter and you might be interested in that, you can subscribe so you can get ring the notification bell so you can get notified when those videos are uploaded, or you can just check my channel every now and again and see if those videos have been uploaded. And yeah, with all that being said, let's get into the video. The first creature from Creatures of Sonaria that I will be talking about is the only flying creature that I will go over in this video, that being the Aeolinus. Aeolinus, in terms of powers, doesn't really have all that many. Obviously, it can fly, I said that already, but in terms of elemental abilities, it doesn't really have any, or at least it shouldn't. In terms of size, Aeolinus would be quite large when transferred over into Monster Hunter, and it should be larger than pretty much every flying creature that is in Monster Hunter World. And for the environment I will be placing it in, I will be putting it in the Ancient Forest for this video. Aeolinus, in terms of size, should be bigger than both Rathian and Rathalos, making it the largest flying creature in the Ancient Forest. And it should also be, obviously being bigger than Rathalos and Rathian, it is bigger than pretty much everything that is there. Obviously, it's bigger than Rathalos and Rathian. It should be bigger than Anjanath. Obviously bigger than things like Kuliyaku, Puke, Great Jagras, or basically pretty much everything that is in the Ancient Forest. With there only being one creature there, one monster there that is bigger than Aeolinus. That being Deviljho, which is not always there as it is a invader monster and will only sometimes be in the area. So, for the most part, Aeolinus should be the largest thing that is at the Ancient Forest, which should give it a number of advantages immediately. Obviously, being a flyer, learning its environment and where everything is shouldn't really be much of a problem for Aeolinus, considering that they can learn their environment back at Sonaria quite quickly and easily, even as hatchlings, and they can also remember different areas of Sonaria and go back to them even if they've only visited those said areas once before. So Aeolinus should be capable of figuring out the Ancient Forest quite easily, especially given that there are forests and jungles in Sonaria that they would obviously eventually come across. The Ancient Forest should be a pretty familiar environment for Aeolinus to be at. Finding water and prey items shouldn't really be much of a problem for Aeolinus either. Which brings us to the main relevant part that is going to be the main problem Aeolinus runs into, and is going to be the main thing that I have to talk about throughout this video for all of these creatures. That being how they compare to the other creatures that are already in all of the different locales of Monster Hunter. When it comes to most of the smaller, large monsters like Kuliyaku, Great Jagras, Puke, and Tobi-Kadachi, they're really not going to be much of a problem for Aeolinus, and as a whole, aren't really going to matter all that much. Aeolinus can deal with creatures that have far more potent toxins than a Puke. If those creatures' venoms and poisons can't put down a Aeolinus, there is no way that a Puke's poison would ever be capable of putting down a Aeolinus in really any situation ever. And obviously it's going to be much smaller than an Aeolinus physically. A Great Jagras, Kuliyaku, Puke, or a Tobi-Kadachi would get picked apart by a Aeolinus in a physical fight, especially once you consider the fact that a Aeolinus is not only much bigger than them, but Aeolinus back in Sonaria are consistently capable of lifting, throwing, and physically overpowering things much greater than them in terms of size. So obviously, something like Tobi-Kadachi being much smaller than it isn't really going to stand much of a chance against Aeolinus in a physical fight ever, really. Anjanath might be able to put up, or obviously it would be capable of putting up quite more of a fight than something like Tobi-Kadachi, but as a whole, if Aeolinus can put up a fight against something like Gyrotis, which is going to be superior to Anjanath in pretty much every way when it comes to a fight, I don't really see an Anjanath being able to do really all that much to an Aeolinus. Its fire attacks might do something, especially because Aeolinus likely wouldn't expect something like a Anjanath to be shooting fire, as it would probably think a Anjanath is just a really ugly looking Gyrotus. It probably wouldn't see the fire attacks coming, though they don't really matter if the fight is going to be mostly physical, which it is, because Aeolus doesn't have any long-ranged attacks. It is probably going to just fly over to the Anjanath and either slash it up to death, or rip it apart, or just pick it up and drop it from the sky. So the fire, although might catch the Aeolus off guard, isn't going to be too crazy of a problem for the Aeolus, especially once you consider the fact that the Aeolus should be more than capable of overpowering an Anjanath pretty easily in a physical fight. Rathian isn't going to be much of a problem either, although its poison might be able to mess a Aeolus up. If an Aeolus can shrug off venoms from creatures that's whole defense is poisons and toxins, something that uses toxins just as a form of just as something it kind of has, like a Rathian, not really a primary weapon. I don't really think a Rathian's poison is going to be enough to kill a Aeolus, though a Rathian or Rathalos poison could do something to Aeolus, probably. Physically, in terms of physical strength, Aeolus should be physically superior to Rathian or Rathalos. However, there is a problem that Aeolus would run into if it tried to fight either, that being the issue of speed. Aeolus is nowhere near as fast as Rathian or Rathalos, and it especially is not as fast as Rathalos. Additionally, it is not as agile in the air or on the ground, meaning if a Aeolus was to get in a fight with a Rathalos, the Rathalos should have a relatively easy time maneuvering around the Aeolus. Now, given the fact that Aeolus is physically stronger, it is a lot more durable as well, and the fact that it isn't super slow on the ground, I obviously think if the fight turns physical, Aeolus would kind of whoop a Rathalos. But in the air, given Rathalos' huge speed advantage, and the fact that Aeolus isn't immune to fire damage, and the Aeolus cannot fight at a range as it lacks any form of ranged attack, I do think it is highly possible that a Rathalos could potentially kill an Aeolus in a 1-against-1 fight. And also, if it is a Rathian and Rathalos pair, I do think it would be... I really don't think it's that far-fetched to say that both of the Wraths working together would be capable of bringing down a lone Aeolus. Now, granted, if a Aeolus were to be, let's say, if it was a pair of them, obviously they should be fine, but most of the time, a Aeolus would be solitary on its own, meaning it's not really going to be all that rare for a Aeolus to end up having a run-in with both of the Wraths when they are together, which obviously is a problem for it. However, in a 1v1, most of the time Aeolus would probably beat either of them, though it would be with some difficulty considering the fact that the Wraths can fight at a range, and while yes, they won't spam their ranged attacks, it's obviously they would run in to fight physically. Eventually, it is highly possible that a Rathalos or Rathian could potentially bring down Aeolus in a 1-against-1 fight. Aeolus losing a 1-against-1 wouldn't be some unheard of situation. And then you have the other big problem a Aeolus would run into in the Ancient Forest, though I don't think it would be as big of a problem as the Wraths. Obviously, Devil Joe is something I have to talk about. Now, Devil Joe is in fact a invader monster. It was not going to always be in the ancient forest, and thus is not always a threat to the Aeolinis. However, occasionally a Devil Joe would be in the area, and it is highly possible that a Aeolinis would run into a Devil Joe. Now, chances are the Aeolinis is not going to try and fight a Devil Joe. Devil Joe is bigger, and Devil Joe would likely remind Aeolinis of a lot of other really big predators that kill Aeolinis canonically back in Creatures of Sonaria, and that can consistently kill Aeolinis. Aeolinis probably isn't going to try and fight a Devil Joe unless it absolutely has to, and most of the time it isn't going to absolutely have to do so. If, however, for whatever reason, a Aeolinis decides to fight a Devil Joe, I do not think it is going to go very well for the Aeolinis at all. Yes, I do not think that a Aeolinis is completely and totally outclassed by a Devil Joe in terms of physical strength. Aeolinis can put up a fight against things that are similar in size to Devil Joe, like Gyrotis. However, Gyrotis, while yes, not substantially smaller than a Devil Joe, are smaller than Devil Joe, and physically speaking should be inferior to them. And although they aren't massively stronger, Gyrotis are moderately stronger than Aeolinis in terms of raw physical strength, meaning a Devil Joe should be capable of physically overpowering a Aeolinis, albeit with some form of difficulty. Add on the fact Aeolinis can fly, I don't think it is a completely one-sided fight in Devil Joe's favor, just completely, though I do think the fight favors Devil Joe absolutely. And that's especially so once you account for the fact that the Devil Joe will, as time goes on, get angry, and they have a rage buff, and once that comes out, the Devil Joe should go from a bit stronger than the Aeolinis, then quite a bit stronger than Aeolinis. And also, Devil Joe has Dragon's element that it can shoot as a breath attack, meaning not only should it be quite a bit physically stronger, but Devil Joe should also be faster on the ground and has a long-ranged attack that it can use to snipe the Aeolinis at a range when the Aeolinis is flying, which is obviously a huge problem for Aeolinis, especially given that Aeolinis isn't as resistant to elements as many other creatures in Creatures of Sonaria. Dragon element would be quite a big problem for Aeolinis in a fight against Devil Joe. And as a whole, I don't think Aeolinis is going to be able to kill a Devil Joe really ever. At least under normal circumstances, it should not be something that really ever happens. So, with that being said, how does Aeolinis do against the other monsters in the Ancient Forest? It kind of gets whooped by Devil Joe, and it would be in direct competition with Rathalos and Rathian. However, beyond the Wraths and Devil Joe, I really don't see any major threats to Aeolinis in the Ancient Forest. Pretty much anything that isn't the Wraths or Devil Joe kind of just gets destroyed by Aeolinis. And with Aeolinis being able to fly, it can easily avoid Devil Joe, and unless the Rathalos and Rathian are together, I do favor Aeolinis in a fight in a 1-against-1 against either, especially against Rathian. So, as a whole, I think Aeolinis would do pretty well in the Ancient Forest overall. It would obviously become one of the new apex predators and would be obviously a top predator of the area. The only thing that would be capable of consistently beating it in a one-against-one fight, that being Deviljho, isn't always in the area to begin with, meaning as long as a Deviljho isn't around, a Aeolina should be the apex predator of the ancient forest, unless a Wrath pair is around. But beyond a pair of, like, a Wrath pair and a Deviljho, I really don't think much is going to put up that much of a fight against a Aeolinas. And other than those two, pretty much everything can serve as a pretty consistent food source for Aeolinas. And obviously, being able to fly, Aeolinas should be capable of finding shelter and making a nest quite easily. And I really don't think anything's going to pose too much of a danger to their young. As a newborn Aeolinas, well, an Aeolinas, as a baby Aeolinas, as soon as it is capable of leaving the nest, should already be capable of defending itself relatively well. They should be capable of keeping their population up quite easily. The main threat to a young Aeolinas would be Rathian and Rathalos, and pretty much everything, and maybe Puke, but considering Aeolinas watch after their babies, Puke would probably run in fear if they saw an Aeolinas baby, in fear that the mother or father is around. So, yeah, Aeolinas should be fine in the ancient forest. If considering the ancient forest and Wildspire Waste are next to each other, and the fact that Aeolinas are hot monsters or creatures, it is possible that Aeolinas might go to the Wildspire Waste occasionally. However, I'm not really going to go in detail on that, as it's pretty similar to the ancient forest, except you add one more thing that can kind of put up a fight against Aeolinas, that being Diablos. But, like, beyond Diablos being another thing that Aeolinas has to worry about, Aeolinas shouldn't really have that much of a problem in the Wildspire Waste either. You're basically giving it one more thing to compete with, that being Diablos, but you're simultaneously giving it more food sources like Baroth and Geratotus, while simultaneously giving it all of the same food sources it had previously, except you're removing Jagras and Great Jagras, and you're instead giving it a bunch of little fish and deer. So, yeah, it should be pretty much the same thing in the Wildspire Waste. Aeolina should be fine there as well. And it probably wouldn't go really anywhere else. Those would be the two main areas. They'd mainly stay in the ancient forest, though I could see some of them occasionally traveling to the Wildspire Waste. As a whole, I think Aeolinas would survive in Monster Hunter World. They'd fit in pretty well. They'd fit in really well, actually. Being new apex predators, they'd be fine for the most part. There's not that many things that can really take them down that they would ever really run into. So, yeah. Aeolina survives. The next creature from Creatures of Sonaria we have to talk about is the Diocrin. It's time to talk about a very venomous and poisonous boy here. Earlier, when we were talking about Aeolinas, I talked about how there are some creatures in Creatures of Sonaria that are far more venomous and poisonous than Puke, and Diocrin is one of them. Diocrin is its main form of defending itself, as well as killing its prey, is via using its poison to kill its prey. This is also a pack hunting creature, though it is noted that Diocrin can occasionally be found as loners, they most commonly hunt in packs, meaning for Diokrin, I will be assuming this is a small pack of them we are talking about. And Diokrin are quite a big step down when compared to Aeolinus when it comes to physical strength and size. Diokrin in terms of size should be about the same size as, let's say, a Zetsuyaku. That's the type of size monster we are talking about now. However, and in this video, I will be assuming we're talking about a pack of roughly 5 individuals. In terms of physical strength, they should be superior to something like Kuluyaku or Zetsuyaku, albeit not by its substantial amount, as their primary weapon that they use for both killing aggressors and their prey is, like I said, their venom and poison. So yeah, in terms of their poison, it can do a lot of things. Obviously, it can kill you. But additionally, it can sap your stamina. It can cause exhaustion. It can cause your immune system to just turn off. It can cause you to become paralyzed. It can cause confusion. It can cause all kinds of crazy different things that can really mess something up. And that's just the stuff that, and one bite from a Diokrin should cause all of those effects and more pretty severely. And now you should probably imagine if there's 5 of them continuously jumping on a monster, biting it, and then retreating. And you can probably imagine how the effects of these guys' venom is going to stack up quite fast. Diokrin would be a pretty big problem for everyone in Monster Hunter. And for this, I will be putting them in the Ancient Forest and the Coral Highlands, as I believe they could really live in either. So we have quite a few monsters to talk about for them comparing to. Obviously, Diokrin are quite a bit smaller predators and are very, very fast and can jump very, very far and very, very high. They should be capable of scouting out their areas and finding out the area and finding pretty much anything they're really going to need whilst in either environment. So finding things like shelter or water really shouldn't be a problem for Diokrin in the Coral Highlands or the Ancient Forest. Which brings us to the main thing that's going to determine whether or not they can survive. That being how they compare to everything. Starting off with the low tiers of both the Ancient Forest and the Coral Highlands, any Jagras, Great Jagras, Shamos, Zetsuyaku, Kuluyaku, or Puke are obviously going to get pimp slapped by 5 Diokrin. These guys physically are stronger than a Zetsuyaku and are about the same size, and we're going to be assuming that there is 5 of them working together. Add on their crazy, ridiculous defensive poison and offensive venom. These things should be capable of tearing apart any low-tier creature quite easily, as one of them can kill a Zetsuyaku 1v1. If 5 of them jump a Zetsuyaku, obviously they'd tear it apart. And I can say the exact same thing for all of the other creatures that I just all the other monsters that I just mentioned. Something like a Tobikadachi would probably avoid a pack of Diokrin at all costs, as it doesn't really have any way to deal with the poison or venom, and it's really not that much bigger than them. And with there being 5 of them and their very common tendency to pin things around their size down and just fill them with poison to kill them in about 3 seconds, if a Tobikadachi gets caught by a pack of 3 or more Diokrin, then Tobikadachi is gonna get picked apart, or is just going to get knocked unconscious because of its systems are getting overloaded by the amount of poison, or the poison would just kill it outright almost instantly. So yeah, Anjanath, it would basically is just going to get ankle bitten like players do in the game. Anjanath could kick a Diokrin, but they're quite quick and can jump and like to jump on top of larger creatures to bite at them and inject their venom. Anjanath doesn't really have any resistance to venom, like, at all. So a 5 Diokrin constantly jumping on its back and biting it, injecting venom into its system is going to obviously kill an Anjanath quite fast. Rathian and Rathalos, being poisonous or venomous, whatever you want to call it, creatures and having toxins that they can inject into their opponents, Rathalos via their claws and Rathian via their tail, they would likely have some form of resistance to poison, but given how potent Diokrin toxins are, and the fact that there will be 5 of them constantly biting at a Rathalos or Rathian, even if the Rathalos or Rathian manage to win the fight, they would likely succumb to the poison afterwards. Which brings us to how that fight would go, and honestly, I think a Rathalos would probably be capable of beating a pack of Diokrin. Physically speaking, a Rathalos should be much stronger than one singular Diokrin. Yes, if they all jumped on the Rathalos, they could maybe pin it down, maybe, though I honestly doubt it. A Rathalos physically should be capable of overpowering a Diokrin extremely easily, and they are also extremely weak to fire damage, and Rathalos and Rathian both can shoot fireballs, so I'd hope you can put 2 and 2 together on how that's going to go. As a whole, I really don't think Diokrin would mess with Rathalos. I think they would try once, get their butts kicked, and then probably never mess with a Rathalos or a Rathian ever again. And if you're wondering why I didn't mention fire when I talked about how Diokrin would maul an Anjanath, is because Anjanath isn't really crazy at using its fire, and Diokrin could dodge around Anjanath's fire very easily because they're much faster than an Anjanath. They can jump ridiculously high and fast, and I just really don't ever see a Diokrin getting tagged by an Anjanath's flames, so yeah. And if you're wondering how a Diokrin versus a Deviljho would go, Deviljho can, constantly just say nuh-uh to effects from Elder Dragons, so it should be capable of just saying nuh-uh to Diokrin's venom, so yeah. Diokrin's only win con is Deviljho is immune to, and they probably wouldn't mess with the Deviljho to begin with, so yeah. As a whole, I think Diokrin should be fine in the Ancient Forest, and most of areas in the Coral Highlands as well. Diokrin can deal with most things in the Ancient Forest, and the 3 different things that they can't deal with, they can avoid. So they should be okay for the most part. In the Coral Highlands, it's a bit tougher, as Odogaron would be a massive threat to them, as Odogaron is extremely fast and could probably tear one up pretty easily. They would also be in direct competition with Zetsuyaku, though I doubt that Zetsuyaku is realistically putting up much of a fight against the pack of Diokrin, let's be real here. Palumu probably would get packed up by Diokrin. It doesn't really have any resistance to poison, and given the fact that they can jump into the air after it, and the fact that Palumu lacks any threatening range attack at all, I really don't see Palumu being much of a threat to Diokrin, especially if it is a pack of them. Legiana is a massive threat, obviously being a apex predator, being able to fly much faster than Palumu, being physically capable of probably ripping a Diokrin in half, and also being able to exploit one of the Diokrin's weaknesses, that being ice. A fight against a Legiana would go very poorly for a pack of Diokrin. And Pink Rathian would go even worse than a fight against a normal Rathian, as it is literally just a stronger Rathian. So yeah, it'd be smart for them to not avoid pretty much all of the big apex predators of the Coral Highlands. But other than Odogaron, Legiana, and Pink Rathian, they should be relatively okay in the Coral Highlands as well. So yeah, Diokrin also survives. The next creature we have to talk about is the Geoptyxina, and for this video I will be calling them a Geo because I'm not going to repeatedly say Geoptyxina the entire time I am recording this segment of the video. I'm not going to repeatedly say Geoptyxina because eventually I'm going to say it wrong and I'm going to feel stupid for saying it wrong because I've said its name 30 billion times. I'm just going to be referring to, calling it a Geo in this video. So when I say Geo, I'm talking about Geoptyxina, okay? So yeah. For the environment that we are putting Geoptyxina in, I literally just said its name normally, is going to be the Elder's Recess. I mean, and probably for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, look at it and tell me it doesn't belong in the Elder's Recess. And Geo is going to be running into a problem that the previous two have not ran into yet. That being the issue of water and food. Geo is a herbivore, unlike the previous two, or in other words, it eats plants, which in the Elder's Recess are a lot harder to find. Now, they are around, meaning Geo can absolutely find food, and it shouldn't be that big of a problem considering they're just general biology where they don't really have to eat all that much, especially considering how lazy they are. So it's not that big of a problem, though it is going to be a bit more of an issue, and it's not going to be something that they're overly used to when it comes to food problems. And the exact same thing applies to water. In the actual game, there isn't actual water that you can find in the Elder's Recess literally anywhere on the map. We know that there has to be some somewhere because obviously there are monsters there that can survive, so obviously there has to be water somewhere. We just don't know where, but eventually, although it might take some time, a Geo should inevitably find its water and food and understand where it needs to go. So, although it would not be as comfortable, and it would be much different than what a Geo is used to, a Geo should be capable of finding food and water and surviving. Just they'd be forced to be quite a bit more active than they usually can be back in Sonaria, where plants are a lot more abundant and easy to come by, no matter what area you're really in. And in terms of finding shelter or a home, that's not gonna be a problem for Geo at all. I mean, just look at it and look at the place it's going to be in this video, bro. I don't think I need to explain why a Geo would have no issue finding a shelter or just a place to just stay at. I don't think I need to explain why that is. Which brings us to the big problem that Geo is going to run into when it is at the Elder's Recess, that being the abundance of powerful monsters that are there. And there are quite a few, so let's just go through them. The first one we need to talk about is Dodogama. For a fully grown Geo, a Dodogama is not a threat at all. Dodogama would probably never attack a Geo because, while yes, a Dodogama is stupid, I don't think it's stupid enough to go after something that is several times its size like a Geo. Especially if the second that a Geo gets territorial and mad that its territory has been invaded by a stupid-looking lizard that looks like it is chronically dumb. It's not going to take kindly to a Dodogama tearing up its place of residence and would probably smite a Dodogama into next week. With its tail. Dodogama for a adult Geo is not a problem. Now, Geos do not look after their children. They don't care about them. They just kind of lay their eggs and then just kind of leave and let their babies figure it out. So, a Dodogama could potentially see a baby Geo as food, but the second that the Geo starts to approach reasonable sizes in its growing process, it's not gonna have to worry about Dodogama that much. And obviously a adult one wouldn't really have to worry about a Dodogama at all, because the Dodogama is literally incapable of harming the Geo because of how armored it is, and the Geo can one-shot the Dodogama in more ways than one. So, yeah, the Geo doesn't have to worry about Dodogama. Azurathlos is a bit more of a problem, though I really don't see these two fighting each other very much, as they probably wouldn't really go to the same areas in the Elder's Recess as each other, so them fighting is something that would happen very rarely, and I really don't see either of them dying in this situation because the Geo is too slow and too short to catch the Azurathlos, the flying dragon, but the Azurathlos lacks the firepower to actually kill a Geo, so the Azurathlos would probably shoot it with a couple fireballs, maybe try to scratch its shell, and then conclude, I am incapable of harming this tank of a herbivore, so I'm gonna just leave, and it would obviously just leave. Another creature, or another monster that Geo would run into often is Uragon, and Uragon is not going to be an issue. A Uragon would get pimp slapped by a Geo. The Geo should be taller, well, yes, probably just as long and way heavier. The Geo's tail would probably knock an Uragon unconscious, if not rattle its brains with one swipe, and the Uragon can't really hurt the Geo anywhere that isn't on its neck, which it probably can't even reach that well, if at all. So yeah, Uragon gets smacked in a fight against the Geo. Basilgeuse is going to be effectively the same situation as Azur, just Basilgeuse is stronger, but I mean, it's still gonna be the same situation. It drops a couple bombs on Geo that do pretty much no damage whatsoever, and then it concludes it can't really do anything to Geo and then just flies away. And if it tries to get up and close in a physical fight, then it's just gonna get slapped by the tail, and if it doesn't get knocked unconscious, it's going to be like, oh, nah, man, I'm out of here, and just fly away, because it is not going to, I doubt it's going to want to get its brains spilled by a giant crystal turtle. So yeah, it's Geo's fine against Basil Geese as well. The next thing that it would have to deal with is Devil Joe, which it should be fine. Devil Joe, physically speaking, should be stronger than a Geo, though I'm honestly not sure if a Devil Joe would be strong enough to actually pick up a Geo, given the fact that a Geo is going to be substantially, and I do mean substantially, heavier than a Devil Joe, and would actively be fighting against the Devil Joe. I really don't think a Devil Joe would be capable of actually overpowering a Geo, even though it is technically physically stronger, just for weight reasons. And a Devil Joe is not armored at all, and so it really doesn't have any protection against the razor blade that the Geo has for a shell on its back that the Devil Joe can't even get through, by the way, and the massive shredder tail club that the Geo has at the end of its tail. So yeah, a Devil Joe would probably try to fight a Geo and would get slapped in the face and just screw off after that and try to go kill and eat something that is much easier to fight. And the final thing that we have to talk about before we talk about the 3 different Elder Dragons in the Elder's Recess is Brachydios, which probably would never even pick a fight with a Geo to begin with. So I'm not even going to really get into it because it's just going to come down to Geo is too armored for Brachy to really hurt. Brachy would realize that and kind of just leave afterwards. Which brings us to the 3 Elder Dragons, those being Nergigante, Teostra, and Kushala. Kushala would probably never fight a Geo. It really doesn't have any reason to, and Teostra really doesn't have any reason to do so either. They can't eat a Geo, and Geo, while yes, I don't think it would really be capable of killing a Teostra or Kushala, because they can just spam it from the sky until it dies. I really don't think they would ever really use up all that time to kill something that they literally can't even eat. So yeah, Geo would never really even fight either of them. And I really don't think a Geo and a Nergigante would fight ever either, because Nergigante only really fights Elder Dragons, or it only eats them, meaning it doesn't have any reason to fight the Geo. And it wouldn't start a fight with the Geo, and the only way the Geo would start a fight with the Nergigante is if the Nergigante continuously stayed around wherever the Geo was currently living. And even then, the Nergigante probably would just be like, oh, okay, bro, bye, and would probably just leave. So they never would really, the Geo would really never fight any of the Elder Dragons that are there. And as for Xeno'jiiva, I mean, Geo would never really fight Xeno'jiiva because it would never come into contact with Xeno'jiiva. So, yeah. As a whole, I think that the main problem Geo would run into isn't even the massive amount of incredibly powerful carnivorous creatures that are in the Elder's Recess. Rather, it is the very small amount of water and food that the Geo would have to work with would be far more likely to be what ultimately ends up killing a Geo, as nothing really has any reason to fight a Geo because none of them can eat a Geo, and the Geo can pimp slap everything that isn't a Elder Dragon that is there. So, yeah. Geotoxina actually survives in the Elder's Recess kinda comfortably. it doesn't really have a problem with any of the monsters that are there. The problem that it is going to run into is remembering where the water and food is. But as a whole, the Geo should be fine for the most part. The next creature we have to talk about is the Mujuswima, and for it, I will be placing it in the Coral Highlands. You could make the argument that it would be in the Ancient Forest, but the only place in the Ancient Forest it would ever be is the beach, where it could literally avoid everything, so obviously it could survive there. And I don't really think it being there would be all that likely anyway, so for this, it will be in the Coral Highlands. And overall, the main problem that a Mujuswima is going to have whilst in the Coral Highlands is going to be its speed. Mujuswima, in terms of size, should be about the same size as a Anjanath, maybe a little bit bigger. They are obviously quite large and would be the biggest thing in the Coral Highlands. However, that comes with the drawback of being incredibly slow. Mujuswima are not fast at all, and they cannot run very long. They do have two ways they can compensate for this. Number one, they kind of blend in with the colors of the Coral Highlands relatively well, so they could hunt quite similarly to how they do already, which is being ambush hunters. And the other way they deal with this, their slowness, is the fact that they can go invisible, or to an extent they kinda can. In lore, it's not really invisibility, it's more so color changing to be harder to see, but in the game it's invisibility, so for this I'll assume it's some kind of pseudo invisibility where they can change color quite well to blend in very well. So, and obviously they would be an ambush hunter just like they are normally because of this. Now, Mujuswima would have some adjusting to do, as most of the time they like to swim around, as they are semi-aquatic, most of the time going to be in the water, and obviously the Coral Highlands, while yes it has lots of water they can easily access, they can't really swim in said water, like, at all. So they are going to have to adapt to hunting purely on land there. Which will be quite weird for them, considering this is something that they don't usually have to do. Which brings me to the part where we talk about how they compare to the creatures that are there. Mujuswima doesn't have any form of ranged attack, special abilities, or powers other than color changing. It doesn't have a water or fire breath or anything. It can't do that. It's a physical monster that goes up close to its opponent and beats the crap out of them. So, yeah, that would be pretty much what it does here as well. Obviously, that's not going to change. Shamos, obviously, are not going to be a problem for a Mujuswima at all. They would cower in fear of a Mujuswima and run away, and it wouldn't really worry about them because they're too small and too fast to catch. Zitsuyaku could probably escape a Mujuswima, considering that it can stun most things with its flash attack, and the fact that it should be moderately faster than a Mujuswima, meaning it should be capable of escaping if it sees the Mujuswima coming, and if it doesn't see the Mujuswima, it's highly possible that it will hear it. So a Zitsuyaku could easily get killed by a Mujuswima, though it would also be hard for the Mujuswima to sneak up on it, so that wouldn't really be a reliable food source, and they would never really be that much of a threat. Palumu could fly, meaning they can very easily escape a Mujuswima. However, Monster Hunter monsters are quite aggressive, so it is highly possible one might try to fight a Mujuswima at first. And if it did, I mean, the Mujuswima is massive, and with so much range, even though it is a purely physical fighter, a Mujuswima would easily snatch a Palumu out of the sky and probably kill it in one bite. and if it didn't die to one bite immediately, it would immediately die to the ridiculous amounts of blood loss that it would be experiencing after that one bite. So Palumu isn't really much of a threat to a Mijisuima. And after one or two Palumus get eaten by a Mijisuima, any other Palumu in the area should understand that they can't really fight a Mijisuima and would start avoiding them. And considering how good a Palumu can hear, it's highly plausible that a Palumu would hear a Mijisuima coming and just fly away the second it hears or smells it. So, yeah. Palumu might be a good food source at first, but they would not be very reliable or consistent prey for very long. The next big predator we have to talk about is Legiana, and honestly, I don't think Legiana is going to be a very consistent food source for Mijisuima either. Mijisuima should be capable of very easily snatching a Legiana out of the sky, but Legiana have long-ranged attacks and can obviously fly, meaning they could just sky spam their abilities and probably hurt Mijisuima fairly bad, but I don't really ever see a Mijisuima dying to a Legiana. And if the Legiana makes one wrong move or gets too close, it's gonna get snatched out of the sky and probably picked apart. So Legiana can also obviously escape a Mijisuima quite easily because it can fly, and once Legiana's in the area understand that we can't fight this thing, they'd probably just start avoiding it. Another fight that is a bit more interesting, though, is the fight between Odogaron and Mijisuima, because although Mijisuima would be much physically stronger than a Odogaron and far more durable, a Odogaron is extremely fast and agile and very aggressive, meaning it is highly possible that a Odogaron would attempt to fight a Mijisuima at least once. And because of how fast Odogaron is and how slow Mijisuima is, it is possible that a Odogaron could potentially bleed a Mijisuima to death. However, it is going to be quite risky, as one even half decent hit from a Mijisuima would probably kill, or at the very least fatally injure, or just kill immediately or fatally injure an Odogaron, even if the hit isn't really direct. And if the Mijisuima can obviously get a hold of the Odogaron, obviously that is an instant loss for the Odogaron. Because of how risky the fight is, I feel like an Odogaron would probably attack for a moment. It would have one close call and then probably just say, nah, screw this, I'm out, gang. I'm not risking that, and probably leave afterwards. So Mijisuima could potentially kill Odogaron, but I could see an Odogaron potentially bleeding a Mijisuima to death if the Odogaron is extremely skilled, extremely careful, and the Mijisuima just gets unlucky, or the Odogaron gets extremely lucky throughout the fight. So yeah, that's could potentially happen. And then you have Pink Rathian, which Pink Rathian should be the strongest thing I've mentioned so far, and considering they have long-range attacks and they have poison, it is possible for a Rathian to kill a Mijisuima by spamming its fire. But then again, if the Mijisuima gets close to the Pink Rathian, it's kind of just over for the Pink Rathian, as physically speaking, there's not much a Pink Rathian could do against a Mijisuima in a physical fight, as Mijisuima have surprisingly strong bites, very powerful arms, and should be capable of snatching a Pink Rathian out of the sky. And although Pink Rathian do fly, they are usually on the ground more than they are in the air. especially when compared to something like Rathalos. So it is highly possible that a pink Rathian could get grabbed and torn apart by a Mijiswima. However, by adopting a different fighting style and just sky spamming, or it's spamming its breath from range, or just slowly picking at the Mijiswima's back, occasionally it is possible for a pink Rathian to wear a Mijiswima down, especially given that Mijiswima do not have very good stamina nor endurance. So yeah, that is also possible. And the last, another thing that could end very poorly for a Mijiswima is a Kirin, a fight against Kirin. Physically speaking, if a Kirin gets anywhere near a Mijiswima, it's going to get ripped apart instantly, because Kirin up close it's something. So in a physical fight, obviously a Kirin is going to get demolished by a Mijiswima. However, the Kirin in average, normal Kirin fashion could very well just spam its lightning attacks and wear the Mijiswima down over time, which is something that could very, very well happen. So a Kirin fight is either going to go really poorly for the Kirin or really poorly for the Mijiswima. It ultimately comes down to how close the Kirin gets to the Mijiswima. Does it continuously back away and stay out of range for the Mijiswima, or does it risk getting close, or gets too cocky and lets the Mijiswima get too close, is ultimately the question you're asking there. It ultimately comes down to what the Kirin does, which, in my opinion, I consider that a win for Kirin. And then you have the strongest thing that is in the Coral Highlands, that being the Namiel, which I'm not even going to talk about, because let's be real here, a Namiel is going to beat the brakes off of Mijiswima, and there's not much Mijiswima can really do. Mijiswima would physically be weaker, would be slower, and would not have any way to fight back against the Namiel's long-ranged attacks. There's really not much that the Mijiswima can do in a fight against Namiel. The injuries it inflicts on Namiel could maybe be fatal, considering how crazy Mijiswima bleed is, but, I doubt. As a whole, I think whether or not a Mijiswima survives in the Coral Highlands ultimately depends on the fights it picks, as well as how well it can figure out how to hide. All of the little creatures could get away from a Mijiswima quite easily. It is possible for a Kirin to beat a Mijiswima. It is possible although unlikely, it is possible for an Odogron to kill a Mijiswima. It does dog on Paolumu and Zitzi and Shamos, and potentially Legiana if a Legiana decides to fight it. So there are absolutely things that it can kill. However, there are also things that it is possible it could lose to, and things that can absolutely demolish it in a fight. So, as a whole, I think Mijiswima could survive, though it's going to ultimately come down to what fights it picks. So, but overall, I do think a Mijiswima would be fine in the Coral Highlands, for the most part. Which brings us to the final creature we have to talk about in this video, and which is also simultaneously the strongest one I'm going to be talking about in this video. The OG big tier 5 heavyweight creature in Creatures of Sonaria, the Kendall. or the big swamp puppy that makes me mad when it kills me in the game. Kendall in Sonaria is basically the Devil Joe of Sonaria, where it should not be capable of killing all of the big crazy stuff that it kills all the time, and simultaneously it can anyway, for some reason. Kendall is an immensely strong animal and is absolutely the strongest thing I have covered so far. In terms of where it will be, I will be putting it in the Wildspire Waste. However, you can technically make the argument for the Kendall being pretty much anywhere, as they kind of just go literally everywhere. It's basically the Devil Joe of Creatures of Sonaria. It can absolutely invade pretty much every area and go pretty much anywhere. However, I will be mainly talking about it in the Wildspire Waste, as that is the place where I most likely see it going, as the Wildspire Waste does have some kind of swampy areas, and the Kendall's natural habitat is a swamp, so yeah. And I'm not going to really talk about most of the things here, because I don't really think I need to explain why a Devil Joe-sized crocodile T-Rex monster is going to absolutely destroy the big chicken, the ugly chameleon dragon, the literal fish mud monster, and the tiny rock T-Rex. There's really only a few creatures that are relevant when I'm talking about whether or not a Kendall can survive here. Anjanath is an apex predator, and it is going to look like a child compared to a Kendall. A Kendall would probably smack a Anjanath in the face with its tail and send the Anjanath's head flying off its shoulders, or it would slap the Anjanath or just bite it in half. A Kendall is going to absolutely body a Anjanath without any difficulty. And the exact same thing goes for Rathalos and Rathian. They lack the physical power to get past its armor or hurt it to begin with. If they went anywhere near the water, which is where a Kendall should be, it could easily just dart up out of the water into the sky after them and snatch them out of the air, or just send them falling down to the ground with a deafening roar. Diablos gets bodied by stuff like Devil Joe already. Giving a Devil Joe massive arms and armor is just going to allow a Kendall to body a Diablos even worse. And Black Diablos is going to go the exact same way. There's nothing much that Diablos can really do against something that is the size of a Devil Joe, just with more weapon options and better armor. Which brings us to the main thing that a Kendall would have to worry about in the Wildspire Waste. That being, obviously, Devil Joe. Devil Joe and Kendall would be direct rivals if Kendall were to be in the Wildspire Waste. They would be the easily two most powerful things that are there, and the only things that could really put a fight against each other. So, yeah. They would often fight quite a bit for the title of the apex predator in the area. And there's a number of different areas and ways this fight could go, so I'm going to be splitting it up into a few different situations. The first will be out in the open on pure land with no water around. In this situation, this fight is quite close. The Kendall, although the same size as Devil Joe, would likely be heavier due to all of the armor that is on its body. In terms of bite force, it should be stronger, though Devil Joe does have a lot more teeth, meaning in terms of effectiveness, they should be relative to each other. Both of them have a rage amp, though I would argue that the Kendall's is superior, so I would argue abilities in terms of the ones that amp their power would go to Kendall. The Kendall lacks any special powers that give it any form of element or ranged attack, whereas the Devil Joe can shoot a beam of dragon element from its mouth. So obviously abilities and powers as well as range would go to Devil Joe by default. Kendall are relatively smart, and Devil Joe really aren't, so intelligence should go to Kendall. And then you have their auxiliary weaponry. The Devil Joe could kind of use its legs if it leaps, and kind of use its tail as a weapon, and maybe headbutt the Kendall, but the Kendall would headbutt much harder. It's a much more effective and heavier tail. It could use its arms in combat. Its auxiliary weaponry goes to Kendall relatively easily. Kendall is very slow, although it can turn relatively quickly. In terms of actual travel speed, it is quite slow compared to the Devil Joe, which is quite fast and agile, especially for something for its size, and that isn't even accounting for the fact that they can jump comically high. It's comical, bro. It's very funny how crazy a Devil Joe's jumping abilities are. So yeah, mobility and obviously speed would go to the Devil Joe quite easily. And durability and armor go to Kendall. They're heavier than Devil Joe, and they have actual proper armor, whereas Devil Joe does not. So obviously durability and armor are going to go to a Kendall. So when there's no water around, I think it ultimately comes down to how the Devil Joe fights. The Devil Joe and a fight between them that is purely physical, I would probably say goes to Kendall. Being more durable, physically stronger, and having better weapons means that a Kendall should be capable of just kind of brute forcing the Devil Joe. And yeah, the Devil Joe's rage amp would activate first because it's going to be taking more damage, but by that point the damage has been dealt. The Kendall is probably going to win before its rage amp ever really gets activated, and if it does, then obviously the Kendall would kind of just body the Devil Joe from there. Although I do think the Kendall would get pretty hurt in the process if it was a purely physical muscle match between the two. If the Devil Joe starts the fight off by throwing something at the Kendall or spamming its breath attack or both, I could see it potentially going to the Devil Joe, as the Kendall, although should be resistant to most forms of elemental damage, it isn't going to be immune, especially given that it hasn't really ever been hit by anything that is like dragon element. So it would absolutely hurt the Kendall, obviously. And if they proceed to enter physical combat immediately after, I do think the Kendall would probably overpower the Devil Joe, but by that point the Kendall should already be pretty, or at least somewhat hurt, and with a somewhat hurt and nerfed Kendall, as Dragon Element does do that, I do think a Devil Joe could very well pull out the win if it starts the fight off by using its ranged advantage to its fullest effect. Now, obviously, a Devil Joe wouldn't just sit there and spam. That's not how Devil Joe fight. But it would obviously, seeing the opportunity, use its breath, especially if this Devil Joe knows that Kendall is physically superior. It would obviously take advantage of its ranged attacks before it entered physical combat with the Kendall. So in terms of how it goes when they're purely on land, I could see it going really either way. It ultimately depends on what the Devil Joe does, and even then, it could still go either way, even if the Devil Joe starts the fight off by using its range to its advantage, because Kendall, physically speaking, is superior. It could still pull out a win, especially if the Devil Joe activates the Kendall's rage amp before it enters physical combat. If that happens, then the Kendall should overpower the Devil Joe relatively easily. So, yeah. It ultimately comes down to how they fight. I could really see the fight going either way. It ultimately comes down to how the Devil Joe, what the Devil Joe does at the start, as well as just how the fight plays out and where. However, if the fight happens near water, it becomes very one-sided very quickly. If the Devil Joe and Kendall notice each other, when, let's say, the Devil Joe is coming down to the water for a drink, and it sees the Kendall, the Devil Joe and Kendall would engage in combat, and the Devil Joe, not knowing that the Kendall loved the water, would not really realize the danger it's in once the Kendall shoves it into the water. And once the fight enters the water, the Devil Joe is now out of its element, and the Kendall can easily dart around at speeds that are simply ridiculous for something of its size. The Devil Joe, when in the water against a Kendall, would get thrown around and ragdolled because of simply how fast and how strong Kendalls are in the water, and there is absolutely nothing that the Devil Joe is going to be able to do in the water to defend itself from the Kendall. The Kendall would probably never even end up getting its rage amp because of how badly it would be capable of whooping the Devil Joe just in its base form if the fight were to take place in the water. And if the Devil Joe doesn't notice the Kendall and the Kendall manages to ambush the Devil Joe, which is far more likely, then obviously it's just going to go even worse for the Devil Joe. So if a fight happens purely on land, a fight between a Kendall and a Devil Joe would be quite close. But if the fight happens anywhere near water, then the Kendall is just going to absolutely cook the Devil Joe. The Devil Joe is getting washed by the Kendall if the fight happens in or near water. The Kendall could potentially also be in the Ancient Forest, but I really don't think I need to talk about that, as a lot of the stuff that is in the Wildspire Waste can also be found in the Ancient Forest. The only thing that is going to be a problem for the Kendall is going to be Devil Joe, and I already explained why that fight is quite close. Though there is less water, fights that happen purely on land would be a lot more common. And given the very different environment, a Devil Joe might have an advantage over a Kendall. I still see the fight as quite close between the two. So yeah, it doesn't really change. The Kendall simply has more, even easier prey items and a very slightly harder matchup against the exact same main competitor. If we put the Kendall in the Coral Highlands, it is going to wash absolutely everything with the exception of Kieran and Namiel, because Kieran would probably run in fear, and if it didn't, the Kendall would take very little damage from the Kieran's lightning, and then the Kieran would either notice this and run or just get swallowed whole by the Kendall. And if a Kendall had a run-in with a Namiel, it ultimately depends on how the Namiel treats the fight. If the Namiel gets in close to try and fight the Kendall physically, it's gonna get beat up pretty badly, especially if the Kendall's rage amp gets activated. And if the Namiel just spams the Kendall from a range, it would take a very, very, very long time, but eventually it would obviously wear the Kendall down, and from there it would be wraps. So in the Coral Highlands, the only thing that can put up a fight against a Kendall is Namiel, and even then, if the fight turns physical, Namiel is probably getting packed up. If Kendall goes to the Elder's Recess, which it probably wouldn't, but if it does, it's going to absolutely maul Dodogama. It is going to absolutely maul Uragon. It is going to absolutely maul Basilgeuse and Azure Rathalos. It is going to be in direct competition with Deviljho. However, the ground is a lot more open this time, and the Kendall can slam the Deviljho into things much more easy, which is something it would absolutely do. So Kendall probably does better than it does in the Wildspire Waste, and it definitely does better here than it does in the Ancient Forest against Deviljho. So Deviljho fights would likely be slightly easier now. In a fight against Kushala being much smaller and likely physically inferior to Kendall in a physical fight, Kendall would probably win, though Kushala could range spam the Kendall, so it could win. The exact same thing applies to Teostra. If it fought Nergigante, that would be a fight that would likely be a lot more close, ultimately favoring Kendall, in my opinion. At first, I would say Nergigante would be winning, albeit only slightly, and then Kendall would get its rage amp and then probably start to cook Nergigante from there. And if it fights Xeno'jiiva, then obviously Xeno'jiiva would fry a Kendall. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by that. So overall, the Kendall does fine in the Elder's Recess, and if we throw it in the Rotten Vale, literally the only thing that can fight it back against it would be Valhazak, and physically speaking, Valhazak would probably get fried by a Kendall. So, yeah. Kendall is fine, really. There's not a whole lot that's really going to be putting up that much of a fight against a Kendall. Oh yeah, I forgot about one back in the Elder's Recess, that being Brachydios. I think a fight between a Brachydios and a Kendall would be pretty much equal, probably favoring Brachydios, but like it's pretty much the same thing with Deviljho, where I think it's quite close. So yeah, Kendall should be fine pretty much anywhere you put it, really. Especially if you put it in the Wildspire Waste, which is where it would probably be, most likely. And if you're curious what would happen if any of these creatures were to have a run-in with a hunter, then the hunter would kill them, because the hunter can respawn infinitely and just come back with better armor eventually, and then just kill them, because hunters. So yeah. Anyway, with all that out of the way, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would be interested in seeing me put more creatures from Creatures of Sonaria, or just creatures from other verses into Monster Hunter, I would be more than happy to do so. If I ever do this again, I would probably put some smaller, weaker creatures from Creatures of Sonaria into Monster Hunter, so it might be a little bit more interesting. But yeah, so anyway, I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I hope you have an amazing day or night or evening or morning or whatever time it is for you. And with all that being said, peace out.